We're going again. You can hear me all? Okay, great. Sorry.
I can hear you fine.
You can hear me fine? So this morning I have joining me Kylie, Eliza and Pastor David. Kylie, a few words on who you are. If people don't know who you are, they might be joining us for the first time.
Yes, sure. I'm Kylie. I'm quite a long-term member here now, I guess. I'm nearly at 10 years. Another year I might be considered local. I'm at 9 years now. Member of Canberra National Church. That's so true. One more year to go. I know. I'm the head elder of the hall side normally when the side's meeting, which it's not currently. So, I'm just sort of hanging about doing my bit and, just love being part of the community. It's really nice to be back in the building today.
Eliza.
Yeah, so I'm Eliza. I'm a historian student at the ANU. And so this is my 4th year at National. I'm not so much part of the furniture, not local yet. But yeah, so I've been here a few years now, and I do bits and pieces around the church, and yeah.
Playing lovely piano for us this morning.
Yeah, playing piano and on the deacons team and all that good stuff.
And Pastor David.
I'm Dave McDonald. I'm a retired pastor since 2014. They call me Red, retired and extremely dangerous.
Well, this is really exciting for me because, Pastor David, I don't think that we've properly met before this morning. Not that I recall anyway. So we're going to have some fun this morning. I think we've got people from various different backgrounds, which is awesome. For those of you who are joining us from home, we would love for you to be part of our discussion. We've got a Slido, which is a way which you can join in with your questions and your comments. You can join us at slido.com. If you search that in Google, it'll come up. And then you just join our discussion by adding in the number, which is 9874 this morning up there on the screen. For those of you who are here live with us, we have the roving mic. So please feel free to raise your hand and Marcus will come over to you with that microphone at some point. He's disinfecting it, so we're staying nice and safe. So no need to stress there. This week's lesson was about witnessing, but before we jump in, we might just open with a word of prayer before we jump into the Bible and the lesson. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for another beautiful morning. The sun is shining. We are healthy and well. God, I just pray for those joining us at home and those who are here this morning. And for us here up the front, God, may you guide our discussion. May we learn something about you and how to share you with others. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I really liked the title of this week's lesson, which was Making Friends for God. I like the way in which that is worded. And we kind of introduced that topic by seeing people through Jesus' eyes. How do you see people through Jesus' eyes in a practical way? What does that mean to you guys?
I think that means coming up to someone and not making assumptions. Something I find really important when I'm meeting someone for the first time is just to ask questions, listen, try and get a sense of what their experience is, because there is one sense, at least, that I can't see people as Jesus sees them because I don't know them like Jesus knows them. And so I think for me that's first base, getting to know them as a friend, rather than as a project.
Making a friend for God. What about you?
Yes, well, I suppose when we look at people through our own eyes, we possibly see them as they are, or even more negatively as we would negatively see them. But when we read the accounts of the gospel and Jesus, how he interacted with people, the more we read those stories, the more we see how Jesus saw people. And then we begin to learn from him how to look at people properly.
I like the concept that I was reading about of seeing people through salvation's eyes. That every single person that we come in contact with is worthy of salvation, that we all qualify for salvation because we all have the same Saviour. Yeah. And so I think it's sometimes we need to change our mindset when we're dealing with people in terms of really looking at them in a different way than what we do with our human eyes.
I know that for me, myself, I've always found this quite a challenging concept because it's very easy with our nature of who we are as human beings to think about ourselves and how things affect us and how different people coming into our circle, potentially how they might impact our circle. We tend to think about that rather than what their value is as an individual and how Jesus saw them as a child of his, someone that he has died for, that he's made this sacrifice. Salvation you mentioned there, Kylie, and that adds an extra weight on it. It's not just another individual that I'm passing on the street, but that's someone that he thought was so important that he was willing to give up his life for. And it's hard for me to view them in that way when I see someone that I don't know. And so seeing them with that view, it changes everything, doesn't it?
And that kind of touches on a point that, to me, reading through the lesson this week, I felt there was an elephant in the room that the lesson didn't address, but I thought needed some addressing. And that is, well, how does Jesus see us? How does Jesus see me? Does Jesus see me as a great successful project of his, tick the box, yep, that one's done, move on to the next? Or does Jesus see me as someone that he gave everything he had to win? Even he was willing to give his own salvation to win. And it's that kind of radical love that God calls us to and that Jesus showed for us. So I think often when we think, oh, well, how does Jesus see me? Or even worse, sometimes we separate the Father from Jesus himself and say, oh, well, God the Father, he's an angry judge that's just out to get me, and that's how God sees me. Well, no. God gave his only Son. God the Father gave everything he could to win us back. And I think that is the essence of how God sees us.
I sometimes find that a hard concept, not having children of my own, but I know that even with people that I care and that I love about, when you lose someone that's special to you, how much of an impact that can have. So how much more of an impact is that when you have such a close relationship with someone? It's only exponential. We might jump into the word, and I'm kind of skipping around with the days of the lesson. So if you're following the lesson with us at all from home, we're going to jump around a little bit. And I wanted to jump first into John, the story there in John chapter 4. And it's the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And I thought we'd jump there first, because I think it really addresses this viewing people through Jesus' eyes, how he viewed people differently. The woman at the well was someone who wasn't part of the same culture as Jesus. She wasn't a Jew. She had, there were a lot of prejudices at the time around even her culture. But then I know last week even we touched on the fact that women were not seen in the same light as men were, and so she's a woman as well. And then throughout the story we learn about some of her other circumstances which would have set her apart, and I think this is a great place for us to start this morning. So John chapter 4, and I thought that we could read verses 6 to 26.
Could I just, before you go to 6?
Absolutely.
I actually think that verse 4 is really important because it says, but he needed to go through Samaria. So it wasn't actually that Jesus was taking the shortcut. He was actually going where he needed to be. He knew that he needed to be where this woman was. And I think we can't overlook the importance of that, of how important it is to put ourselves where other people need us, rather than expecting people to come to us, that we've got to go to them. And that's just, I think that verse is just so key, because it actually talks about why Jesus is making the choice that he has, that he needed to go because he knew that there was actually somebody in a community that needed that the thing that only he could give, which was the true value, the true view of salvation and what it meant to actually to have relationship with Jesus.
That actually touches on one of the points that the lesson talked about on a completely different day, not related to that story per se, but it talked about the fact of when we are going through life, oftentimes there are divine appointments or things that are set up, and so we shouldn't take shortcuts. Not that God doesn't bless it those shortcuts if we do take them, but being purposeful that wherever we are going, knowing that there may be a person that we can reach along the way. And Jesus really made that part of his everyday life, his everyday walk, that wherever he was going, whether that was through a different town, that he was purposeful when he did that. So Kylie, would you mind then starting?
Yeah, sure.
We can start in verse 4 and we'll read down to verse 26, I think, to start with.
Yeah, sure. But he needed to go through Samaria, so he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans."
Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw.
He told her, Go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said to her, You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem.
You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Pretty amazing that I think that Jesus is so, in such a short period of time, reveals himself to someone who may have been overlooked by the rest of society. And I might actually throw it out to our audience. How does Jesus approach this woman if we kind of refer back to the thought that we've been thinking about through looking at people through salvation's eyes or through Jesus' eyes? How does he approach this woman?
No one's putting their hand up. I'm just going to say that I think that Jesus asked for water. He was essentially buying some time. He was finding a commonality and using that strategy to develop or establish a relationship with the woman, which was awesome. And I think I've been listening to some leadership podcasts by Craig Groeschel. I don't know if any of you have heard him. He's the lead pastor of Life Church in America, and one of the things he says is we will do anything short of sin to reach people who don't know Christ. And I actually think that was modelled by Jesus. It's quite a profound statement, and he was always willing to do whatever it took to reach people. And so but that was based on establishing relationships.
Yeah.
I think also perhaps some of the cultural context can be lost on us 2,000 years later. There was a significance to this woman being at this well at this time of the day, and Jesus meeting her there. what was normal for women to do in the Middle East in this period was they would go out in the early morning or in the evening when the sun wasn't properly up yet. It was nice and cool, and they would go out in big groups so that they wouldn't be bothered by anyone. And yet she is coming in the middle of the day alone to carry a huge jug of water on her shoulder back into the city in the heat of the day. This is a strange thing to be doing. Why would she be coming out in the middle of the day? Well, as we learn through the progression of the story, she has a reason to be avoiding people. She has a reason to not be feeling like she's worthy to associate with the other women. Maybe she wants to avoid them. Maybe they've excluded her. We're not told explicitly. But Jesus comes into this situation. He sees the woman coming to the well, and he can already read into some of her circumstance just by the fact that she's there. Mm. And so I think that is a lesson to us, to be observant and to be thinking of others enough, to be putting others before ourselves enough to try and understand what life is like in that other person's shoes.
Mm. Jesus has compassion for her, doesn't he?
Jesus sees us as we can be, not as we are. Mm. And I think that's the promise of how he sees us. He sees what we will become in him rather than sees us where we are now without him. Mm.
And I can't help but think that Jesus must have known that this woman would be there at that time. And so he sends his disciples off to town to go and get some food so that he can be alone with this woman and talk, freely with her. I think if the disciples had been there initially, she would have avoided the situation and sort of maybe gone back to town. Mm. But since he was just one man there, she probably came, she thought she'd get the water and go on because he wouldn't talk to her anyway. But he did.
Mm. Yeah, Jesus definitely takes opportunities for different people, whatever their circumstances are. And in this situation, Jesus chooses, as you're saying, to send the disciples off. He's there alone. And even if it wasn't the woman at the well, I like to think that if someone else had come to that well during that period, that Jesus would have reached them in exactly the same way, perhaps using different tactics, but he knew that by making himself more approachable, by being alone, that he would be able to reach someone. And sometimes we, I think, are guilty of being around some of the same people constantly, which doesn't allow people to approach us with those questions. Even if they might be in our immediate circle, people are often more willing to ask questions when there's no one else to hear those questions. And the woman at the well, she doesn't necessarily have a question, but she has a yearning that Jesus recognises there at the time.
I think being one-on-one can make such a difference because that helps to establish a stronger relationship, and we see it in some of the other stories. One of the previous stories about Jesus taking the blind man out essentially to the forest and having that kind of one-on-one time with him as he healed him, because it wasn't just about physical healing, it was about spiritual healing. And I think that Jesus treated all people with love and respect and dignity, and that's what he was actually giving this woman. He was actually giving her dignity in that moment because of the reason she was at the well. And I think he proves about how we should approach people, that you can't argue people into heaven. You can love them into heaven, but you can't argue them into heaven. And that's very much what he shows through his interactions with this woman at the well.
Because she does try to challenge him, doesn't she? She tries to give him a few sticky questions and say, well, hey, what about this and what about that? But Jesus doesn't get sucked into it, and he shows her love. And he shows her who he is through that, which is really beautiful. We have a question up on the screen, and it says, what is the equivalent of the Samaritan woman today? Have you ever encountered someone that was like a Samaritan woman in your witnessing journeys, or potentially having an opportunity to share Jesus with someone who might be out of the box?
I think there are all sorts of people that are like Samaritan women, and especially in our society today, which is professes to be really tolerant, but really, in fact, means that your intolerance is sort of more unique to you and your friendship group. I think there are all sorts of people that, I mean, when I was in high school, I really had nothing but contempt for the cool kids, for the kids that were well off and beautiful and smart and seemed to have everything going for them and charismatic, and that just attract people to them. And I had nothing but contempt for those people. And so when one of those people started asking me questions about God, and in the beginning they were very much wrapped up in, "You're so stupid, how could you possibly be a Christian? What about this?" It took the Holy Spirit prompting me to say, well, hang on, take a closer look. Imagine this girl as I see her. And I recognized that she was charismatic. I recognized that people, when she said something, people listened. And so I started praying for her. God, it would be really incredible. Like, you do whatever you like, all in your perfect will. But it would be really incredible if she turned to you and became a Christian. She would be such a powerful witness. And so I started praying for her in year 8. And as I learnt to be more tactful in my responses and less dogmatic, she started asking more questions. And she started to ask questions not in an aggressive way, but in, "Oh, well, you must have an opinion on this. You're a Christian. What do you think?" And in year 11, we started having Bible studies together, and she started talking to other people about God and praising God before other people, praising Christians before other people. And I thought, this is really weird. She's one of the cool kids, right? And then it came to a point in year 11 where she said, "Oh, look, Eliza, I suppose you've guessed by now, but I'm a Christian." And that was just such a beautiful experience for me, that God would give me that experience with her. But also to know that the people that I had contempt for, the people that I thought were part of the problem, not part of the solution, God had different plans for those people.
It's hard, isn't it, to look at people through Jesus' eyes like Jesus did when there are other things at play. It might be the social situation that you're in high school where, you did have contempt for those people. But being able to step back from that situation, it gave you an opportunity. And it can be difficult to do that day by day. We're often interacting with people who challenge our morals, our beliefs, sometimes verbally, sometimes just in the way in which they behave. And it can be hard to meet that where it is and then be able to turn that conversation. But that is what Jesus challenges us to do in this story, isn't it? Is to meet someone without attacking them, without being part of that contempt, but to show them love. And through that, we're given an opportunity to share Jesus and his message.
I think it reminds us who the first person is that we should be praying for. It's probably ourselves, because we need God to change our nature and our opinions, and we need to be honest with the things we struggle with, because we all struggle with different things. If we had a scenario of different types of people who walked into this church right now, if we had somebody who was, heavily tattooed and pierced, and they walked right in the door right now, is that something that for you would struggle to deal with? If we had a very overtly gay couple walk in right now and sit down, would you struggle to deal with that? Everybody is going to have different things they struggle with, or it could be a variety of things, and we're all guilty of it. As much as we like to say we're not, we are. We're all guilty of judging people at surface level. And so I think that it's a broader question rather than about the Samaritan woman, the question that's come through, because I think the person who's on the outer, it's going to be depend on what part of society they come into. Somebody might come into this church and find that they're not accepted, whereas they are accepted by a broader society, or vice versa. So I think it sort of can depend a little bit on the scenario as to what equates to that Samaritan woman nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other than we all have our Samaritan, we all have our Samaritans to deal with, I think, personally.
Absolutely. and that challenges us to walk in our daily walk. And I think that was something which the lesson touched on broadly this week, was the fact that Jesus calls us to be part of this journey for a reason. It's not always just for the people that we are reaching, but a lot of the time it becomes part of our journey. It allows us to grow and develop, to learn more about him. And when we're sharing with other people, we are oftentimes challenged by questions we might not ask. I know that in my journey of doing Bible studies with people, they'll often ask questions that wouldn't interest me, or might not be things that I would have challenged because I've grown up in a certain way. I was very lucky to grow up in a Christian home, and so the questions that I might have are very different from the questions that someone would have if they didn't grow up in a Christian home. And so that challenges me to think about things and challenge things in a different way as well. We've got another question on Slido. What are the boundaries in the Seventh-day Adventist Church that stop us from connecting with each other and non-Christians? And I think this is quite a practical question, day by day, how we are challenged. What are some of the boundaries that you might have found, potentially not for yourself, but just even as being a Seventh-day Adventist, that have stopped you from connecting with others, non-Christian or Christians?
I think in a church context, I don't know about you, but I think and we've talked about it frequently, but I don't know that we've made progress on it, is that we, as Adventists, when you're already an Adventist or a Christian, that you come to church with your church face on, your Sabbath face on. And we're actually so scared of being real and actually revealing our vulnerabilities and the things that we struggle with because we're afraid of judgment. And I think in terms of a church context, that's how we often deal with each other, because we're actually afraid to let down that facade, because then somebody else will see that we actually are sinners. Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to address that. There are no boundaries put up by the Seventh-day Adventist Church as such. As individuals within that church, yes, there are boundaries, but it is not the Seventh-day Adventist Church that puts up those boundaries. I think we need to differentiate between a church body and an individual putting up boundaries.
The church is people at the end of the day, isn't it? It's how we treat each other as individuals. That is what the church is, isn't it? It's not I agree.
I think this is very relevant to what we've been looking at in our sermon series on Galatians, that it's, Paul is grappling with the Galatians, saying, look, you've changed the gospel. It's not the same as the one I preached to you. And in the same way, I think we can be so grateful for the doctrines we have, and so we can care so much about the doctrines that we forget to take them in context, and we forget to keep it in balance with the real good news, which is the character of God, and that he wants to bring us out of our sin.
Eliza, I might get you to just read the end of this story, because I think it's really important. It kind of ties into some of this as well. Would you please read for us verses 27 down to 34?
Okay. And upon this came his disciples, and marveled that he talked with the woman. Yet no man said, "What seekest thou?" or "What were you talking to her about?" The woman then left her water pot, and went her way into the city, and saith to the men, "Come see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ?" Then they went out of the city, and came to him. In the meanwhile, his disciples prayed him, saying, "Master, eat." But he said unto them, "I have meat to eat that ye know not of." Therefore saith the disciples to one another, "Hath any man brought him aught to eat?" Jesus saith unto them, "My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and finish his work."
I think sometimes it was very easy for the disciples who were here. They've been witnessing, to use that word, what Jesus has been doing, and the fact that he interacts with other people. And they marvel, but at the same time they move on quite quickly, I feel like. In verse 27, they acknowledge the fact that he's speaking to a woman, and why are you talking with her? But they're also very quick to turn back to the current situation of we're hungry, here's some food, and they kind of dismiss this experience, which this woman is then a missionary to her whole town, who brings them all out and says, hey, this is Jesus, and this is an experience that I've had with him. And I think part of that may have been their cultural prejudices, the fact that they were willing to dismiss that. I think sometimes that, at least for me, the thing which stood out is when I use the armour of the church that I go to or some of those other things, I can use that as a little bit of a block, and it's very easy for me to then dismiss different things which should be a really special and a really personal experience, and to just wipe it away with some of those cultural things as well.
But at the same time,
at
the same time, it's not a cultural thing to be hangry, like to be thinking, okay, so we've gone for a long morning's walk and we go into town, get some food, bring it back to Jesus, and Jesus says he's already eaten? Like, what's the deal there? I thought we were being kind to you, letting you take a rest. And I think we can all be so focused on lunch or on whatever we're doing throughout the day, on our busy schedules, that when something comes up, we just don't even see. God gives us opportunities for divine appointments that we have no idea. We might go through life thinking, oh, well, none of this fun evangelistic stuff ever happens to me, but perhaps it's not for want of opportunity. Perhaps we just don't have our eyes open to those things.
I was going to say, it's interesting to see how in chapter 3, Jesus speaks to Nicodemus, who is a member of the Sanhedrin. But he comes to Nicodemus in the middle of the night, and it's dark, and he gives him the gospel, and we're not too sure how Nicodemus responds to that. We know later on that he does respond positively to Jesus, but in chapter 3 we're not too sure what Nicodemus is thinking in his mind about Jesus. Now in chapter 4 we find Jesus meeting the woman at the well. She's a Samaritan, not a Jewish teacher, and he meets her in the middle of the day. Which is the opposite of Nicodemus's time. It is broad daylight. And in the beginning of the conversation, she just sees Jesus as a man, and then she sees him as a Jew, not to be spoken to. And then in the conversation, she comes to the idea that maybe he's a prophet, because she says, oh, are you a prophet? Because the Samaritans did believe in one prophet at least, and that is the prophet that Moses mentions in Deuteronomy about a prophet that would come. The Samaritans didn't believe in the other prophets of the Bible, they only believed in the Pentateuch. And so she believes that maybe this man is a prophet because he knows what her life is all about. And then she comes to the conclusion in the end that he's actually the Messiah. And she goes to town to say, hey, maybe this is the Messiah. And in fact, he is.
I think what this highlights, some of you who, for the early service, I was talking about a book I've been reading at the moment, Experiencing God. And I think it ties so well into to this passage, because it tells us how often as humans we keep trying to make our own plans. And they might be good plans that we think, and we're doing them for God. But it's actually the wrong approach, that God's actually already working around us. And instead of us trying to impose our plans over him, he actually wants us to step into the plans that he has, and he wants us to step into the work that he's already doing. And I think this really highlights that he's saying that I'm here to finish God's work. He tells us that. And then a verse we haven't read, which is in 35, he says, behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. So God's doing the work. He's planting the seed. He's preparing the crop. He just needs us to go in and help him with the harvest. And I think we lose sight of that we keep trying to make these great big plans that don't necessarily match what God wants for us, because he's already hard at work. He's working on people's hearts. He was working on this woman's heart. And we've just got to be willing to step into that work that he's already doing, and provide that last little bit of help through relationship. Absolutely. Again, relationship.
Yeah, that was definitely highlighted in the whole topic of this lesson was making friends for God. It didn't say making disciples for God or making soldiers for God, or it used the word friends, and I think that was really key, because it is about having a relationship with people. The people that I call friends are people that I would call on for different things, that I share experiences with, that I've had with them, and it really changes that relationship when you call someone a friend as well.
You can start where you are. You don't need to go big. You just need to actually concentrate on the place that you're at. And if we ran less programs probably and actually offered more friendship and love, I think we'd have a much bigger harvest.
Oh,
At the end of the story there, where the Samaritans come out from the village and talk to Jesus, they then say, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Saviour of the world." Mm-hmm. So it ends off not only with her believing, but all these guys who come out from the village are convinced that this is the Saviour.
absolutely. We've got another question up here. Why is behaviour such an issue with how we deal with people, and what is the solution? I think that oftentimes, and we've been discussing this a little bit, about how our own behaviour can affect the way in which we deal with people. What do we think is the solution, if I can reword that question a little bit, what do we think is the solution in stopping our behaviour from affecting the way in which we deal with people and potentially witness with them?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question, but I'll give a go at giving my answer. I think often first of all, of course, none of us is perfect. We all misunderstand and misstep and say things that aren't quite right or out of balance. And so I think humility in recognizing that, just because this person doesn't respond to me, just because this person isn't interested in what I have to say about God, it doesn't mean Laurie might not do a better job of reaching that person. And that's okay. That's not a slight on me. That doesn't mean I'm trash in God's eyes. It's just, no, personality clashes are normal, and just like when we're making friends, with some people, it's really easy to be friends with people that are friendly, but with someone that you have a personality clash with, it can be a hard slog, and that's a normal part of friendship. I don't think there's necessarily a problem there.
I think that's answered the question. It is worded a little differently. It's a little bit hard to understand potentially where the person was coming from with that question, but thank you, Eliza, for answering that.
And if that's not what you meant by that question, then send in another question and maybe clarify a bit, and we'll see how we go.
This did just make me think of one of the questions which I was asking myself in our notes, and I might throw it again out to the audience if someone would be willing to help me with that one. And it was, how do we share without reacting to those difficult people? When we are challenged with someone who might challenge us, how do we stop ourselves from reacting straight away to that person? Sorry, we have a mic coming to you, Jane.
I think it's really important to actually listen to other people and where they're coming from and their place, their relationship with God, whether it be super strong or whatever it is. I think it's very important to listen to people, because if you're not really listening and all you're trying to do is fix their problems, that's not necessarily going to work out very well.
People are often more willing to share information with you if you do just have an open ear and you're willing to listen to them. Sometimes people need to unburden themselves to someone who is willing to listen or to see their problems and see where they are at the moment. And sometimes that is the best way of sharing, is not actually to share anything at all, but is to actually just listen, and your behaviour ends up sharing with that person.
I think we have to ask the question why somebody's behaved, like why they may have reacted back to you for something that you've said. So you need to both look at the way that maybe you've presented yourself or worded the question, but you also need to understand that other people are going to have triggers in their life where it makes them, for whatever reason, react poorly or negatively to a situation for multiple reasons, and because we've all got different life stories, and we don't know what those triggers are for other people. We've often heard it said about, people who've had an abusive father, the concept of Jesus, of God the Father being a loving God, it can be a very difficult one for them to wrap their head around. And so there's all those different life experiences that have brought people to a certain place that will often trigger certain reactions to situations or comments. And so we sort of, I guess, need to try and understand that, and it's not always easy. If you're someone who reacts easily, I can be like that.
Well, we have our own triggers as well.
That's exactly right. And so we've got to, I think, develop patience and a listening ear, so that we can be willing to try and understand that person's point of view.
I think that comes back to something we talked about earlier, was about that when we witness, we actually develop our own relationship, isn't it? Sorry, Pastor Dave.
No, I think if we can learn to look past the behaviour and the things that may irritate us in that behaviour and start a relationship with that person, things begin to change and the behaviour then becomes nothing.
How many people here, just a show of hands, how many people here are now good friends with somebody who, when you first met them, you didn't really like them? I bet we've all got someone like that in our lives, right? And so can I ask you, what made the difference? How did you progress? Has somebody, just one or two people, got a story or an example of how that you progressed from a dislike or a disconnection with that person to actually having them become a friend? Has anyone got a specific example?
Marcus, down the front.
Yeah.
Others?
There's two. No, that's right. We'll both of you. Laurie, after you.
Got a quick one. I used to be part of a care group, so like an outreaching kind of thing to in Adelaide, so near like the unis. We had a lot of non-Christians coming along. It was good. But the host of that was this guy, and when I first met him, I just thought he was this arrogant guy. He was a doctor, and I just thought he was so up himself. But then as kind of like a group of leaders, we decided, look, we're going to pair up and become prayer buddies. So I became a prayer buddy with this guy, and we'd call each other once a week and just talk and pray. And, ended up finding out he's like the best guy ever. But just, those initial, when you meet someone, they're not necessarily, you don't get the full picture until you get to know someone. And praying, I think, was the big thing.
Absolutely. Prayer's definitely part of that journey.
Mine's rather a simple situation of having to work with somebody that I didn't particularly like. The more we dealt with each other and learnt about each other, we realised that we weren't such a bad lot after all. And it's a case of getting to know one another, and which brings me, if I can make a comment on some of the other questions that were asked. How do we see through Christ's eyes? To me, the whole story of the Samaritan woman is one of divine intervention, where God was able to appease one lady, and through that was able to then answer a lot of questions for the whole village, as well as being an example to his own Jewish disciples.
Absolutely.
I think in answer to that, one of the ways that we do that is not just to look at the symptoms of sin in their lives, but to try and figure out the root cause and what really makes this person tick. What are they interested by? What are the big questions of life that they are looking for answers to? I had a bit of a different situation with a friend at uni. We were in the same class together, and when I first met her, she was, it was her mission in life to tell the world how horribly women are exploited in Australia today, and how this was the same throughout history, all over the world, in every place and time, and how in response we should let men suffer with reverse discrimination for a good 50 or 100 years. And so I was a bit taken aback and tried not to show my shock, and I resisted the urge to argue with her on what was obviously a very political motivation for her. And I just tried to hold back and asked her questions instead and said, oh, that's really interesting. Is that how you think about your male friends? Is that how you think about your dad? What's the life experience that's led you to come to this conclusion? And now, a few years later, we can sit back and laugh about it and think about how immature we might have been 3 years ago. But I think it's in asking those questions and not just seeing something that I disagree with and stamping my opinion on it, but trying to understand, why does this person think this way? What's the deeper problem? If we think about sin as a disease that can be managed and treated, rather than just something that puts you in the too hard box and the lost forever box.
That's something that Jesus often did in his ministry with others, was he often asked a question, didn't he? And he didn't have an answer directly straight away, an argumentative answer, but oftentimes he used a question to get people to think further on what they were actually asking, and it ended up taking them on a journey. Before we get sidetracked potentially by another question, I thought we might jump into Mark, which was one of the other stories which the lesson touched on, which was Mark chapter 8, in verse 22 to 26. It's only a very short passage, but it talked about a blind man and the healing of the blind man. And I think we've talked a lot about that initial meeting, but one of the things which this story touched on was what happens after that initial meeting and that process. And so I thought we might touch on that briefly as well, because I really wanted to get into that part of the lesson. Kylie, would you mind reading for us?
It's just 22 to 26.
Yes, please.
Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town.
I actually hadn't read this story for myself in this way, and I didn't realise until I looked at it in the lesson that the blind man here was healed in two parts. I don't know whether I've heard a different story or whether it's just been skimmed over, but I thought that was really fascinating, and I couldn't understand why. And it was actually a question that the lesson posed. It did pose a little bit of an answer, but I wanted to ask you, why does Jesus heal the blind man in two parts? Why not just heal him straight away? We know that he's healed other people from the dead straight away even. This is just a blind man. Why do it in two parts? Oh, in the audience.
Thank you. Yes, this one was a bit of a problem for me too. But it seems that the blind man was brought by others who had a faith in Jesus. And it could be that Jesus was wanting to see if this man actually had faith in him enough to allow him to do what the man wanted to do, wanted Jesus to do.
Yeah.
If you understand that, yes. So, I've just written something down here. We must continue to have faith and patience with people we introduce to Jesus. Do not judge everyone. Do not judge. Everyone deserves the opportunity to know Jesus.
I think faith and patience is key. I mean, this is not the only healing miracle that Jesus performs that isn't, that Jesus heals someone and they're not healed immediately. I mean, when we think of the story of the 10 lepers that Jesus speaks to, and then he tells them, go to the priest and get him to confirm that you no longer have leprosy. And as they were going, they were healed. And of course, only one came back to say thank you. But this is not, I mean, it does appear that this is a test of faith and a question of, well, you may not feel that you have been healed, but trust me. Another cultural comment that I think is made me much more happy with this passage when I heard it was that it was, I understand, it was really key for Jewish people at the time that the Messiah would have creative power. And so when Jesus comes and makes mud and puts it on the eyes of this blind man, blind from birth, he's not, like, he's doing it in the context of, well, how was man first made? With the dust of the ground and the breath of life. And so Jesus is putting himself up. Who knows, perhaps this man never had eyes. Perhaps this man was born without eyes, without opened eyes. And yet Jesus steps in and creates eyes for him, possibly. I mean, this, at least to the Jewish mind, expecting the Messiah to come and have creative power, Jesus displays his creative power, and then he goes on and fully restores this man that now has faith.
Yes, if I can have my say here too, I think, as Laurie said, it may have been a test of faith for the man himself, because it's his friends who brought him along and not he himself who desired the healing. And it may also have been that the time that Jesus, there may have been an opposition to him that he wasn't ready for at that time and didn't want to confront the people, because he tells this man, he takes him outside of the city, then heals him in stages, and then tells him to go home and not back into the city, because if he had gone back into the city, it may have raised the issue about Jesus and his messiahship and so on, and brought on the crucifixion sooner than what it should have been. And the other thing is that if we see the thing in context, in the event that took place before that, where the disciples hadn't brought bread for the meal, and then Jesus said, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod, and the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was saying, and they thought maybe it's because we didn't bring bread that he's saying, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. But then Jesus says, do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears and fail to hear? And he's trying to teach his disciples that something about himself and his provisions that he can make are always there. And so the healing of this blind man becomes a kind of an illustration, a spiritual illustration for his disciples, because again, after this incident, they go up to Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus asks them, who do you think I am? Who do the people say I am? And they say, well, they think you're John the Baptist or one of the prophets and so on. But then he says, who do you think I am? And then Peter's the one who says, you are the Messiah. So there's a spiritual connection over here of eyesight. Do we see clearly? And this healing of this man may have been a lesson for the disciples as well.
I think I like what the lesson poses is it also a reflection on us and how we view people too. And I think that sometimes we make judgment calls about whether or not somebody is worth taking our time to witness to them, or we might make the judgment call that even if we're trying to witness to them, that they're actually not interested, they're not willing to listen, or you don't think they'll listen, and so you actually don't even make the effort because you've already prejudged the fact that they're actually going to reject the message of Jesus. And so I think it's really important to remember that we actually don't see things clearly ourselves, that we, as much as we've been talking about having the eyes of Jesus, and we can certainly through prayer and supplication and ask him to bless us in that way, but I think somebody else in the audience said that we're never going to see quite the same way that Jesus did, because we don't have his supernatural ability. So we've just got to go on faith sometimes, even when things just look like men walking like trees. That we need to sort of go forth in faith and continue to be a witness to those around us.
It's kind of a two-part, isn't it? It's putting ourselves in the shoes of the blind man and thinking about how we need to potentially look at people differently, as you're discussing there as well, Kylie, as well as the fact that for the blind man, it wasn't just an immediate situation. He needed that extra time. He needed to be taken on that journey of faith. For some people, they need a little extra time to make that decision or come to that conclusion themselves. I didn't realise the time, and I've just had a look up, and we're running out of time very quickly. So I apologise for the questions that we weren't able to get to this morning.
Just quickly, I think just the last thing we didn't probably reflect on fully in this story is just the fact that sometimes it is our faith that needs to be enough for someone else, that they don't always have that faith for themselves, and it takes us, and how important it is not to give up on people. As I was saying, I've got one of my father's cousins is married to this beautiful man for 50 years. He never worried about her going to church, was always supportive of it, but in all that time he was never interested in becoming a Christian or anything else. And for 50 years she never pushed the gospel on him. She just lived it. She just loved him. She accepted where he was, never pushed it. And after 50 years of marriage, he was baptised.
Amen.
And became a fully fledged Christian. And it wasn't because she argued with him, it's because she lived the gospel every day, and she loved him for who he was and for where he was at. And her faith was what brought him into the kingdom of God. Yeah. And we can't forget that. We can't give up on people.
Absolutely. It's very easy to skip over the friends at the beginning who are the ones who bring this man initially to Jesus, but that was so key in this story. I want to leave our audience this morning and our audience at home with a little bit of a challenge, which was at the end of the lesson, and just a thought which I think sums up everything that we've been discussing this morning. And I hope that you take advantage of some of those points, that you open your eyes to share with people where they're at. But it was just this point in the lesson. It says, what choices can you make that will help you have the death to self you need in order to be an effective witness? Oftentimes, we need to take a step back, and we need to look at ourselves and see what it is about our relationship with Jesus that will help us to be able to share with other people, either in our current location, which it talked about as well. There was lots of things in the lesson this week on how we can practically make friends for God. So I hope that you're willing to make a friend for God as you go day by day through your life. Thank you for joining us this morning.